Strange but true stories. Tales from the light side, the dark side, and the other side. I'm Steve White. This is the part of the story when I set up today's episode and what it's going to be about. Some tidbit, a little nugget of information to put us on course for the journey ahead. But I don't want to give away too much about today's story before we get started. It's a bone-chilling, spine-tingler of a story wrapped up in a paranormal blanket of mystery. And if there is a warning to pass along, it would be to leave the Ouija boards alone, people. Sure, they're sold like board games in the toy section of department stores all over the world, but for some, those Ouija boards can be a window to the other side. It's 1983. I'm a 10-year-old kid living in Hamburg, Pennsylvania, a small town in southeastern PA, about 80 miles northwest of Philadelphia. My family, which consisted of my parents, my sister, and me, lived in a small row house. It was a sleepy neighborhood, but filled with kids playing baseball, kickity-can, and other cool games in the parking lot across the street from our house. It was a very innocent time in my life. I had a few older friends on the street who were not quite so innocent, but they looked over me, and they never put me in any direct harm or danger. My sister was an impressionable teen who looked up to an older woman on the street who lived 4 houses down from us in the same row. I'll call her Joan for the purpose of this story. Joan had twin boys, whom I'll call Jason and Danny for this story, and she also had an infant boy named Shane. Jason and Danny were a few years younger than I was, but I considered them my best friends. We played together every chance we had. My sister liked to hang out with Joan, I think mainly because she was a little rough around the edges, an adult who did what she pleased, and she wasn't out to impress anyone. One summer afternoon, the gang of older neighborhood kids gathered in Joan's house to watch television, listen to some music, smoke cigarettes. I was playing with Jason and Danny on the swing set in their backyard until they had to go visit their cousins who lived farther down the street, but on the same block. I can remember going home and finding my sister's brand new Sony Walkman and sheepishly borrowing it to listen to Quiet Riot's album, Come On Feel the Noise. Oh, those were the days. I became bored at home and later decided to pester my sister at Joan's house, since all the older, cooler kids were hanging out there. I wanted to be part of that group. As I opened the screen door of Joan's house, I noticed all the kids sitting on the floor in a circle. They seemed quite spooked when I entered the house, and I instantly was told that I wasn't supposed to be there and that I needed to go home right away. Some of the kids seemed to lean in such a way that I wouldn't be able to see what was lying on the floor in front of them. It looked like some sort of board game. I'm quite certain that being the younger child, I threatened to tell my mom and dad that my sister was up to no good if she didn't let me stay. Well, they relented. They allowed me to stay as long as I never told anyone about what they were doing. I thought nothing of it. I was just proud that I got my way and I was allowed to stay. At this point, I sure wish I hadn't. I heard one of the kids say to my sister, "Are you sure it's okay in front of your brother?" My sister replied that it was fine and I would behave and wouldn't talk about whatever it was they were doing. I became a silent observer to a horror story that has never escaped my mind. What I hadn't known as I walked into the house was that the older neighborhood kids, along with my sister and Joan, were playing with a Ouija board. Being as young as I was, I had no idea what it was or what it did, but I'd find out soon enough. With the curtains drawn and lights off within the house, they began to ask the board innocent questions. They wanted to know to whom they were talking. The planchette spelled the name slowly. D-A-N-Y. David? Okay. I was thinking this game's pretty cool. And obviously the kids touching the planchette were moving it. They continued to ask innocent questions when something changed. Something didn't feel right. Maybe something in the air? I began to feel uneasy. Others in the room began to feel uneasy. Do you have anything important to tell us? Asked my sister. Y-E-S. And then it spelled out, but first a joke. The board answered. My sister looked at Joan, unsure of what that could mean. The board, or David, wants to tell us a joke? With so much anticipation, everyone in the room waited anxiously for the planchette to spell out the question. What in the world could it be? What could it possibly want from us? So when the planchette started again, it took a while, but it spelled out, where does a mother salamander keep its babies? Wait, that's the joke? What kind of joke is that? Nobody understood. Completely perplexed, the neighborhood kids looked amongst themselves in astonishment and confusion. My sister kept a cool head. I don't know, David. Where does a mother salamander keep its babies? She asked. The planchette swirled around the board again. In a jar. Ha, 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 ha. The board answered back. What the heck does that mean? I can tell you that at this point, everyone in the room was a little freaked out. Joan's dog, who was lying on the sofa asleep up to that point, jumped up and ran behind her, obviously disturbed by something unseen. Most of the kids tried desperately to make some light of the situation, to break the terrible silence and unease. But before anyone could truly react to what happened, the planchette began to move again. 2 weeks, fire, 2 kids die. 2 weeks, fire, 2 kids die. My sister read aloud as it spelled those fateful words. Whoa. At this point, everyone in the house had had enough. Joan shouted, "Okay, that is it!" and pushed the Ouija board under the sofa. Nobody knew what to say or how to act. What house? What kids? Where was this going to happen? So many unanswered questions, but no one had the courage to touch that thing again. The kids in the neighborhood all went home after jokingly coming up with a plan for some sort of fire watch for the next couple of weeks. But in short time, I pretty much forgot about that day. I was young, had plenty of activities and sports during the summer. I guess you can probably see where this story is going, though. It wouldn't be so horrific if it hadn't actually happened, and thereby deeply affecting everyone in our neighborhood. But it did. I remember it so vividly, even now, nearly 40 years later. It was right at 2 weeks after the Ouija board messages. I was sleeping one night when my mom came into my bedroom, yelling that there was a fire. She said we needed to get out of the house right away. I was still half asleep, didn't understand what was happening. I followed my mom halfway down the steps only to turn back around and crawl back into bed. She came back to get me, picked me up, carried me down to the living room. And that's when I began to wake up. I could hear the sirens now and smell smoke. I could see the smoke, but it didn't seem like it was coming from our house. What's going on? Where's the smoke coming from? What is all that noise? So many questions running through my head. I still don't know if I truly understood what was happening. But soon enough, I would have all the answers. All the answers I never wanted. As my mom pulled me out of the front door of our home, I looked to the left, down the street, just as flames exploded through the windows of Joan's house. The sound was deafening. The fire was relentless. I could feel the heat from 4 doors down, as if I were standing right next to a fireplace. Aluminum siding was melting and dripping on the roofs like hot wax dripping from a candle. The sound of breaking glass and wood popping, sirens, and men and women screaming became all too real for me. Suddenly, my heart sank. I didn't see anyone come out of Joan's house yet, and they weren't on the street anywhere. Where was Jason and Danny? Where was Joan and her little baby Shane? I began to cry and shake. Everyone in the neighborhood was standing around in shock. My family watched from across the street as Joan broke through the second-floor bedroom window. She had to throw Shane from the second-story window to firefighters and volunteers below. They caught him, and he was okay. And then she jumped. They caught her. But what about... Mom? Where's Jason? And Danny? My mom couldn't answer. It would take another hour or so before firefighters extended a large ladder up to the third-floor windows where they had been sleeping. And then a sight I could never forget or truly comprehend at that age. I watched as 2 black body bags were lowered from the ladders to the ground where a white van awaited. And painted on the side was a word I had never heard before: coroner. Jason and Danny lost their lives in that fire, and I lost my 2 best friends. A couple of weeks later, we found out some more disturbing news, and the rest of the neighborhood kids desperately tried to understand everything that had happened. We learned that the day of the fire, Jason and Danny were supposed to go to their cousin's house to sleep over. Something happened, and Joan became angry with them. She decided that they would stay home that night and go to bed early. She ordered them upstairs to their bedroom on the 3rd floor and locked the door behind them. For the next couple of hours, Joan decided to have a party. While Jason and Danny slept 2 floors above, Joan was drinking alcohol and smoking cigarettes with some older friends. When the party was over, she went to sleep on the 2nd floor where Shane was sleeping in a crib in her room. What nobody knew was that a smoldering ember of a cigarette had fallen into a cushion where alcohol had been spilled, thus starting a fire that would ultimately claim the lives of 2 of her children. Incidentally, the fire began in the sofa under which lay the Ouija board that had been hastily shoved under it 2 weeks prior. We also found out that Jason and Danny died of smoke inhalation. They suffocated. That's not to give you morbid details, but do you remember what the board asked what the joke was 2 weeks prior? I guess the same thing would happen if a mother salamander put her babies in a glass jar. They would suffocate too. Isn't that right, Chris? I asked my sister that night. Her face turned white. She couldn't even bear to answer me. I don't think she knew I had remembered the joke that David from the Ouija board had asked us. Suddenly it all made sense to me. Such an awful moment, yet it somehow made sense. Chills run down my spine, and my hair stands up every time I recount the details of that fateful night. None of the neighborhood kids spoke of that day with the Ouija board again, or the night of the fire. I notice a visible uneasiness if I bring the story up to my sister to this day. And one of the most interesting aspects of this entire tragedy came about 30 years later. My ex-wife's mother decided to hire a psychic to connect with lost loved ones. While I am a believer in the supernatural, I tend to maintain a healthy dose of skepticism until something personal happens to convince me otherwise. I sat through the psychic's readings to other family members with my arms and legs crossed, throwing off a little body language attitude that showed I wasn't buying into this. Toward the end of her readings, she finally turned to me. She spoke of my grandfathers and how I would pretend to be like them. I thought, well, okay, that's true, but I'm not convinced. Then she said, I'm picking up a word. For some reason, I'm seeing bricks. Perhaps a stone mason? Oh, okay. Then she continued. There were twins. Was their last name Mason? At this point, I'm beginning to feel uncomfortable. Where could she possibly be going with this? I proceeded to tell her that I had friends with the last name of Mason while making sure that I was not guiding her or accidentally providing her with extra information. She interrupted and said, yes, of course. They died in a fire. Do you know who they are? I wasn't sure what she meant. They are your guardian angels, she said with a smile on her face. And that was that. Perplexed, overwhelmed, scared, yet somewhat calm and at ease with what she had just told me. I met some friends at a local bar and had a beer, and from that day on, I had somewhat of a change of perspective when I think of those kids and everything that's happened. I still visit my parents' house on that street. Not a moment goes by that I look at that house just 4 doors down and not think of my best friends, that Ouija board, or all of the events that took place that fateful summer night. And no, I have never touched a Ouija board, nor will I, ever. Some summer nights when the rain is pouring, I can still smell a faint hint of smoke in the attic of my parents' house, and the memories come rushing back in an instant. Wow. What a story. I mean, man, I've got chills after that one. And it was shared with us by a longtime subscriber to SBT. So, tell us what you think about this video in the comments below. And if you have a story you'd like to share with us, a paranormal event that you can't quite explain, well, we'd love to hear it. Send your story with lots of details in an email to strangebutTrueStories2@gmail.com. Maybe we'll put it on our channel. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks to all those that have. And stay safe, everybody. I certainly appreciate all the positive and encouraging words from our viewers and subscribers, not only in the comments, but also the emails that we receive to the channel. We're all in this together, and we'll get to the other side of it soon. Be well. Thanks for watching this video. I'm Steve White. Until next time.